The following program is rated PG and may contain scenes of violence, nudity, coarse language, and mature subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised.
All it takes is one moment, and in an instant, lives are shattered and entire communities destroyed.
The scale of the destruction was hitherto unknown and hitherto unthinkable.
From human-made catastrophes to nature's most destructive forces.
You're hearing a roar that goes beyond sound and goes into your chest and becomes this deep bass rumble.
Disasters can turn our everyday routines into a fight for survival.
Pregnant women and bringing that new life into the world is special. So a disease that targets that is going to be more terrifying.
These are some of the most devastating events in human history.
They came back late at night to total silence.
Something horrible has happened here. I need to flee the area in case whatever has happened to these people is about to happen to me.
August 23rd, 2005. The Gulf Coast is bracing for impact as a monster hurricane approaches. Little did they know, Mother Nature was brewing a disaster that would forever change a city and the people who call it home.
Hurricane Katrina was born as what we call a wave, or an area of disturbed weather that begins to move across the Atlantic Ocean and feeds on the extremely warm water that it's moving over top of. One of the interesting things about hurricanes is you might have this idea that it needs tremendous wind to begin. It actually needs absolutely calm conditions to get going.
Early the following day, the depression intensified into a tropical storm as it headed generally westward toward Florida, strengthening into a hurricane 2 hours before making landfall at Hallandale Beach on August 25th.
Katrina had an interesting path because it actually had two landfalls as a hurricane. It struck Florida down closer to the Keys or the Everglades as a Category 1, moved across the entire peninsula. Normally when you have a hurricane interact with land, it begins to weaken. Katrina did not weaken. Not only did it not weaken, it began to strengthen as it came across the Everglades. Then it moved out into the Gulf of Mexico itself, and it just went nuts. It was just the absolute perfect spot for it to undergo very, very rapid intensification, and it got up to a Category 5. It then moved almost directly north towards New Orleans.
Wide-scale evacuations were called for, and mandatory evacuation orders were issued for large areas of southeast Louisiana, as well as coastal Mississippi and Alabama.
24 hours before Hurricane Katrina reached New Orleans, the mayor issued a mandatory evacuation order. So in most people's minds, that means everyone should evacuate and the city should be empty when Hurricane Katrina arrives. But in actuality, what happened is 100,000 people either chose to remain, did not evacuate, or could not evacuate. And I think it's probably maybe a little more important to focus on why the people could not evacuate, even if they wanted to.
A huge number of people who stay, I'm not going to say choose to stay, but who stay is because they are vulnerable populations who can't move to begin with. So speculating, perhaps there were people who just did not have the physical capacity or capability to move. And we see this a lot in disaster where people need access to specific kinds of equipment or assistance in order to get out of a space. So fleeing is sometimes a privilege offered to individuals who have access to a means to flee and also have the physical capacity or capability to flee. Now, of course, there are still some fully capable people or able people who could flee and choose not to. And we see, again, in some of those situations, people having a very close tie or another reason to stay.
As a final effort, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin established the Louisiana Superdome as a refuge of last resort. Some 20,000 people took cover from the storm in the sports arena.
At least 30% of the 100,000, so 30,000 people, chose not to evacuate because the emergency shelters would not allow pets. And this is a really interesting side of non-evacuation behavior, because people feel a responsibility to their pet. They don't want to leave them behind to fend for themselves. They don't know when they'll be back to their home to feed their pet, and so they chose to stay behind.
With winds reaching up to 280 kilometers an hour, the city of New Orleans was in Hurricane Katrina's crosshairs, making landfall as a Category 3 hurricane on August 29th over southeast Louisiana and Mississippi.
To intercept Hurricane Katrina, I actually drove from Toronto all the way down to Gulfport, Mississippi. We're at ground zero for this thing. There's a very famous warning that was put out by the National Weather Service.
Hurricane Katrina. Devastating damage expected. High-rise office and apartment buildings will sway dangerously, a few to the point of total collapse. Airborne debris will be widespread and may include heavy items such as household appliances and even light vehicles. Water shortages will make human suffering incredible by modern standards.
You know, to see that, to hear that, I have to admit that I for the first time in a long time, was actually kind of scared. The rain and wind just begins to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up, and then all of a sudden you're seeing water beginning to flood into the town around you. You stop being able to see very far because the wind has now gotten up to a point where it's atomizing the rain and the spray off the ocean. And then the wind gets stronger and stronger. You're hearing a roar that goes beyond sound and goes into your chest and becomes this deep bass rumble.
When people think about hurricanes, unfortunately, they mostly think about the wind. And while the winds of hurricanes are certainly devastating and can be huge, it's really the storm surge that's the largest problem.
The thing with storm surge is that it's not one giant wave that comes in. It's much more insidious than that. What happens is one little wave comes in a certain distance. The next little wave comes in a little further, and then a little further, and a little further. All of a sudden, it just gets beyond that one point where it begins to flow through the town, and it never stops. It just keeps coming and coming.
New Orleans is a pretty unique setting. It's a bit of a bowl shape in that areas on the margins of the city or on the outskirts of the city can be as much as 8 or 9 or 10 feet higher than the central portion of the city. So there are many neighborhoods that are actually below sea level and below the level of the Mississippi River. So New Orleans was protected by a levee system.
When Katrina came ashore, this massive storm brought a huge storm surge with it. We're talking more than 5 meters above normal water levels. All of this water is flowing up into New Orleans, and the levees aren't high enough. And what happens is this water starts overtopping the levees, and they break. Within the city of New Orleans, there were 53 dike breaks. So that means the storm surge was able to get into the city through all of these breaks and very quickly flooded the city. And in many areas, the water was up to the first story of the building. So we have a huge amount of storm water flowing into the city of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina.
The subsequent flooding destroyed major sections of New Orleans, with over 100,000 homes and businesses affected.
At that point, people are scrambling and trying to evacuate from their neighborhoods that they thought were protected. We heard of many cases where people were essentially climbing into the attic space in their house, and as the water levels rose to that level, they began to essentially chip their way through the ceiling. Sometimes they would use an axe, sometimes they would just use their hands, and they had to be rescued on the top of houses.
New Orleans is like a soup bowl. We knew if those levees went, we would be dealing with that many meters of storm surge that can't go anywhere. And that's another important issue when it comes to New Orleans. The storm surge that we dealt with, the meter or 2 meters of storm surge that we dealt with, drained away fairly quickly. So once the wind stopped, storm surge was gone. New Orleans, that water stays there and it has to be pumped out. Now you've got a toxic soup of gas, diesel, dead bodies, mold, destroyed houses, other pollution because of other industries being in there, and it's all just sitting in the city, not able to be pumped out, and it's going to be there for a couple of weeks.
When the storm surge overwhelmed the city's levee system, it caused widespread flooding to 80% of the city. The strong winds also caused significant damage to buildings, homes, and infrastructure, leaving many residents without shelter.
Katrina is a hurricane in a class all its own. It wiped out a city. It destroyed the infrastructure over a huge chunk of the North Gulf Coast. One of the things that strikes me, even to this day, was seeing everyday items lying in the street. It was just like the whole area had been through a war zone. It was tough to see that, and to know that people had probably lost their lives. I mean, they had absolutely lost their businesses. We walked past a bar that we had seen before the hurricane, and it was this beautiful Irish pub. There was nothing left of it. That was tough to see, because to realize that, like, I could leave and all these people now had to deal with the destruction of their lives.
Inadequate evacuation plans, slow response from government agencies, and lack of resources exacerbated the impact of the disaster, causing widespread human suffering and loss of life. The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina resulted in one of the largest natural disasters in U.S. history, with an estimated cost of $108 billion and over 1,800 fatalities.
Most of the deaths in the United States had dropped from those 5,000 to 6,000 numbers in the early 1900s down to 2 or 3. When we went through Katrina, there were 100 people dead within about a mile radius of where we were alone. And that was really frightening. That was hard to know. But then to have 1,800 deaths, I mean, that was unheard of. And that's why Katrina, as an American hurricane, is on a class of its own.
After Hurricane Katrina, many Americans questioned the preparedness and response of their country to the disaster. What factors made New Orleans so vulnerable? And could all of this destruction have been avoided?
For millennia, the Mississippi River has flowed down through North America and deposited silt at its mouth in the Gulf of Mexico. This has produced the Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana, and the city of New Orleans is built on that delta. The geology in and around New Orleans is a soft, silty soil.
New Orleans over time has been settling, and that's directly a result of the human settlement in that city. As people are using the area and as they're pumping groundwater, the land is subsiding, and because of the river management in place over hundreds of years, what should be a natural deposition of sediment from the Mississippi River has been starved. It's a very slow, cumulative process, but New Orleans is sinking, as the saying goes.
While the geographical features of New Orleans made the mass flooding possible, the city was protected by a levee system.
Levees, like any engineered structure, are built to certain design criteria. And by that, I mean, what is the scenario that you're trying to protect for? So we could build levees that would protect for a 10,000-year hurricane or a 10,000-year flood, but it would be hugely expensive. And so there's economic decisions that are made that go into levee construction. My understanding is that levees were built to withstand a Category 3 hurricane. They could easily have been built to withstand a Category 5, but that was seen to be too expensive and also much less likely over the perceived lifetime of a levee, which is probably about 50 to 100 years. So you choose an in-between level of protection. But unfortunately, with Hurricane Katrina, there was a lack of maintenance on the levees.
The issue with New Orleans is those levees before Katrina were built a long time ago and had not undergone the repairs and the retrofits that they needed to withstand a storm on the scale of Katrina.
When the levees fell, it was up to the authorities on the ground to save those that were in danger.
An emergency plan is only as good as how well it has accounted for the vulnerable people within the community that it was written for. If the vulnerable people are not included within the plan, then the plan is simply not going to function. Hurricane Katrina turned into a disaster of this magnitude because so many people were not able to evacuate the city. The most vulnerable people were essentially let down and were left in a city that was about to be severely flooded and without key pieces of critical infrastructure such as electricity and access to healthcare for significant periods of time.
I don't have home. I had a home downtown, but it's gone. It's under the water. I have nothing.
Emergency response capacity was overwhelmed. It's impossible for any municipality really to deal with a disaster of that scale. So they need to coordinate with other levels and to call in additional support.
It became very quickly apparent to officials that they needed more help and they needed outside help. And the mechanisms that exist in government typically to ask for that help is to go through existing agencies, emergency management agencies, in this case FEMA in the United States, to obtain access to critical resources and assistance that are available in times of crisis. And the tripwire here is that there's a very unclear set of practices or regulations around how to involve the government, how to involve FEMA in an effective way, and that confusion creates delays as these agencies try to work through the issue. And so while administratively people are trying to figure out what to do, the situation on the ground is worsening.
The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina had a profound impact on the soul of the United States. The images of widespread suffering, loss of life, and government inaction caused many Americans to question the nation's values and priorities.
When the governor requests for assistance from FEMA, the requests weren't met in the expected manner, and so response couldn't take place in an effective way. These disparities between the decision-making structures and the requests that were being made and how they were being handled was a huge part of the failure of the response in this event. And this ultimately led to a lot of changes being made after the event at the federal level to basically correct a lot of this confusion that had taken place during Katrina.
It also highlighted long-standing inequalities such as poverty and racial discrimination, and led to debates about government responsibility and the role of the state in protecting its citizens during disasters.
They hadn't got most of everybody out of there but us.
This led to public outcry and calls for reforms in disaster preparedness and response.
The United States as a whole experienced a shock to the system when Katrina happened. Nobody had dealt with a destructive hurricane on that scale ever, and to be quite honest, since. I mean, it sits in its own category because of the amount of damage that it did. But there's a silver lining here. It taught organizations like the federal management agencies, it taught local governments, it taught local people what can happen, and that led to a much better response to hurricanes since then. And to be honest, I've been through many hurricanes since then, and what I saw then to what I see now is like night and day.
The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration developed advanced early warning systems to help predict the track and intensity of hurricanes, giving residents more time to evacuate. The City of New Orleans also developed better evacuation plans in the event of a future storm. And the federal government invested billions of dollars in rebuilding and improving the city's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and public buildings.
Progress has been made since Hurricane Katrina. Plans have been revised. Infrastructure changes, particularly in terms of flood mitigation, have been made, and a renewed focus has been put on providing evacuation options for vulnerable people to ensure that the city is better prepared. However, the city does remain lower than sea level, which is always going to put them at risk of additional flooding should flood mitigation measures fail.
While hurricanes have the power to destroy cities, over 100 years ago, another catastrophic event shook a city to its core, leaving untold devastation in its wake. (1917). The First World War is raging in Europe. Halifax is mainland North America's closest large port to Europe. This status gave it outsized importance in times of transatlantic conflict.
Halifax was one of the major British ports of the First World War.
Halifax historically is an amazing deep water port. It's a narrow channel that goes deep in from the coastline. It's really isolated from the ocean surf, and really for centuries has been a major port on the east coast of North America. So it's really important to that war effort.
December 6, 1917. Just moments after sunrise, the SS Mont Blanc entered Halifax Harbor, carrying a large quantity of high explosives, and was en route to Bordeaux, France from New York City.
The Mont Blanc is carrying three main things: gun cotton, TNT, and picric acid. Picric acid and TNT are extremely explosive materials.
At the same time, the Norwegian ship the SS Imo was making its way into Halifax Harbor. It too was on an urgent mission, as it was carrying much-needed grain supply to feed the starving people in the war-ravaged nations of Europe.
The SS Imo and the SS Mont Blanc found themselves on a collision course in Halifax Harbor.
The Imo was expected to give way to the Mont Blanc, but the Imo's captain believed that he had the right of way.
A dangerous game of chicken ensued when each of them thought that the other would turn away.
The Imo's captain tried to signal the Mont Blanc to change course, but the Mont Blanc's crew did not understand the signals. The crew of the Mont Blanc also failed to signal the Imo that they were carrying dangerous cargo. The two captains cut their engines, but the momentum kept the ships moving forward. The Mont Blanc tried to steer out of the way, but it was too late.
The ships broadside each other, they rub against one another, and the act of the two steel hulls rubbing against each other causes a huge amount of friction, sparks, and heat to be generated. Barrels of benzol, basically a mixture of flammable compounds extracted from coal tar, spills onto the deck, and a fire erupts on the ships.
For a while, the ship floated in the harbor on fire. It was quite the spectacle, so many people gathered to watch it burn, unaware of the risk, unaware of what the ship was carrying and what danger they were in.
That fire spreads very quickly. It spreads across the deck, and it gets down into the holds where we have the picric acid and the TNT.
At 9:04 a.m., it happens. In an instant, the Mont Blanc violently explodes. This devastating explosion was the largest the world had ever seen.
Really, when we look at what a bomb is an explosive generally encased in a metal, most commonly steel. When we think about the Mont Blanc, it's really a giant bomb. Once we get the fire to the TNT and the picric acid, almost the entirety of those materials within the ship instantaneously explode and turn into a rapidly expanding gas and shockwave that spreads to the city of Halifax.
All buildings within 800 meters are destroyed in a blinding flash of light. The enormous energy release tore through the ship at 1,500 meters per second.
The amount of explosive material on the Mont Blanc was mind-boggling. We're talking about nearly 3,000 tons of TNT. That's the equivalent of about 1,500 cars worth of TNT in terms of mass. The explosion that ensued on the Mont Blanc was the largest single explosion on Earth prior to the creation of nuclear bombs. This was an absolutely massive explosion.
The scale of the destruction was hitherto unknown and hitherto unthinkable, and the fallout of the explosion had significant repercussions for Eastern Canadian history.
The explosion was massive and devastating, killing approximately 2,000 people and injuring over 9,000 others. The blast also caused widespread damage to the city of Halifax, leveling entire neighborhoods and damaging or destroying over 12,000 buildings.
The explosion and the resulting tsunami sent an 18-meter-high wall of water some 3 blocks into the city. The nearby Mi'kmaq community of Tufts Cove, where Mi'kmaq had lived for generations, was completely destroyed.
The disaster disrupted the war effort and underscored the importance of Halifax as a key target for enemy attack. The city rallied to aid the victims of the explosion and played a critical role in supporting the war effort in the years that followed. But just how did the Mont Blanc become such a destructive bomb?
Explosives are different than other combustible compounds. You need three things to get a fire to occur. You need oxygen, you need the combustible material, the wood, paper, what have you, and you need heat. With explosives, you don't need the oxygen. The chemical structure of the actual explosive includes the oxidizing agent. TNT is trinitrotoluene. The nitro groups in the toluene provide the nitrogen and oxygen as oxidizers to create the chemical reaction that is the explosion. And because those compounds are in such close proximity, the reaction occurs at exceptionally high rates, faster than the speed of sound, and we get explosions. So the TNT that's in the Mont Blanc is just sitting there waiting for a heat source to explode.
But the Mont Blanc wasn't just carrying TNT. It was also carrying over 2,000 metric tons of picric acid.
One of the things about picric acid that makes it particularly dangerous is that it's a contact explosive. The picric acid is so unstable that if it becomes impacted, if I just literally flick it with my finger, it explodes. But this has the same explosive power as TNT. So it's extremely, extremely dangerous. It's literally just waiting for something to set it off.
In the history of disasters, the Halifax explosion stands out as the largest single explosion prior to the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945.
The power of nuclear weapons is measured in kilotons of TNT. When we talk about the Hiroshima bomb, we're talking about something that produced 15 kilotons of TNT worth of energy. That's 15,000 tons of TNT. This is a massive amount of material. So nuclear bombs have a huge amount of explosive potential in a very small area. When we look to the Mont Blanc had almost 3,000 tons of explosive material on it. So we're talking kiloton levels of explosives. That puts it in the same kind of category and same kind of range as nuclear weapons. It's almost mind-boggling that you could have an explosion of this immensity from conventional explosives.
The explosion was one of the largest man-made non-nuclear explosions in history.
When we think of contemporary explosions to the Halifax Harbor explosion, there are very few that come to mind. The two that are most prominent and most recent are the West Texas explosion of fertilizer and the Beirut Harbor explosion.
The Beirut explosion on August 4, 2020 was caused by the ignition of approximately 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that had been stored in a warehouse in the port of Beirut, Lebanon. The explosion resulted in widespread damage to the city, killing more than 200 people, injuring thousands, and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless.
The explosion was the equivalent of about 1.1 kilotons of TNT. Bear in mind that the Halifax explosion was 3 times the size of that. When we look to West Texas, which was an extremely destructive event that destroyed the plant and killed a large number of people, we're actually talking about an explosion that was only 7.5 to 10 kilotons equivalent. So relatively small compared to what occurred in Halifax Harbor. So the scale of the explosion that occurred in Halifax Harbor really doesn't have a comparison in modern history.
The Halifax explosion was a devastating accident that obliterated a community. Many died instantly from the sheer force of the blast. Others drowned in the subsequent tsunami.
It was an 18-meter tall wave. And that kind of energy that's needed to create that is huge. When we think about water, it's very dense and it's very heavy. In order to create a tsunami, we have to displace that water. We actually have to push it downward in order for it to rebound upward in a big tsunami wave. So the explosion that occurs on the Mont Blanc is actually not only driving upwards into the air, but driving downwards into the seawater in the port of Halifax.
If the Mont Blanc, which was carrying explosive materials, had properly displayed the required warning flags, and the Emo had not attempted to cross its path, the collision that led to the explosion could have been prevented.
Halifax taught us very, very costly lessons, and we paid an incredible human price to acquire the knowledge that we did about safety standards, about transportation and storage of highly dangerous and flammable and explosive materials. We have a lot more knowledge and information and good practices that we should be falling back on to protect people from these types of incidents taking place. Since 1917, we've seen incidents not unlike the Halifax explosion take place elsewhere in the world. And to see that in some cases the recommendations and the safety practices and the best practices are not being implemented is often heartbreaking to see, because the consequences of failing to integrate these lessons are so severe, and we should know better by now.
The Halifax explosion had a significant impact on the world, particularly in terms of disaster relief efforts. The scale of the destruction and the number of casualties prompted an international response, with aid coming from across Canada, the United States, and Europe.
One of the few positives of this event is, following it, significant advancements were actually made in the study of ophthalmology, in terms of repairing and helping people who suffered eye damage. In addition, there were a number of people who suffered burns, including children. Care for burn patients was learnt and improved upon as a result, and many best practices were adopted following the explosion that are still practiced today.
The disaster also led to the establishment of the International Red Cross and the development of new techniques for emergency response and disaster management. In Halifax, the explosion led to significant changes in the city's infrastructure and the implementation of new safety regulations for ships carrying hazardous materials. As we reflect on the tragedies of the past, it's important to remember that disasters can take many forms, from massive explosions to unseen threats. In the 1980s, thanks to changes in work habits, with both parents in the workforce more and more, the need for ready-to-eat fast food saw a steady climb. But as the demand grew, so did the dangers. In June 1985, the Los Angeles County University of Southern California Medical Center first noticed that pregnant women were ill with listeriosis.
Listeriosis is a disease that's caused by the Listeria bacterium. This bacteria lives in soil around agricultural areas, and it can get into our food supply. Listeriosis, if you get it as food poisoning, is generally mild for most people, but it does have worse effects in some people. So first off, if you're very old, or you have a weakened immune system, or very young, then it could cause meningitis. It could actually infect and inflame the membranes around the brain, which is life-threatening in nature. It could go into your bloodstream and be a systemic blood infection, or sepsis, which is also very life-threatening. When you look at pregnant women, what was happening is pregnant women with listeriosis may have had it more mild, but they were having miscarriages more commonly than not having listeriosis. So there was something that was suggesting that it was affecting the health of the baby.
Between January 1st and June 14th, 58 mother-infant pairs sickened, some with children who were born with birth defects because their mothers were listeriosis victims. There was one white woman and one Asian woman among the mothers. All the rest, 96%, were Hispanic.
Pregnant women and bringing that new life into the world is special. So a disease that targets that and interferes with that is going to be more terrifying than a simple, I spent the weekend being sick with food poisoning.
During the outbreak, 29 deaths occurred, 8 neonatal deaths, 13 stillbirths, and 8 non-neonatal deaths. The investigation quickly focused on Mexican-style fresh cheeses, and cheese made by Jalisco Mexican Projects, Inc. was eventually implicated in the outbreak.
When we're talking about packaged foods, there's a huge number of contamination events that occur in North America every year. Listeria, salmonella, other bacteria regularly get into our food products, and because of breakdowns in quality control and processes within factories, sometimes that makes it out into the marketplace.
In addition to the food safety investigations, the outbreak involved criminal investigations and about 150 civil cases.
Food claims are quite interesting insofar as there will often be a recall policy in place. I seem to recall that there were 16 states where that product was recalled from, and those policies would cover things like public relations and advertising and the physical cost of the recall in removing that product from the market and destroying it.
Listeria is really common. It's a common bacteria. It shows up in milk and dairy and meat products fairly regularly. So it's out there, we know about it, and Jalisco really should have been ensuring they were taking steps to prevent it.
While the 1985 Listeria outbreak was one of the most deadly in U.S. history, this foodborne pathogen continues to kill. How can food manufacturers protect the public and create safer foodstuffs?
As engineers, we know Listeria is a big problem. In many instances where we're packaging and producing, especially meats and cheeses, it really loves these materials to eat and live in. And in large factories, it could be a huge issue. Once it gets into a factory, it permeates all the equipment. So if you're slicing cheese, the cheese slicer becomes contaminated. And then after the cheese slicer becomes contaminated, the packaging line becomes contaminated. So once you have a Listeria outbreak within a factory, it spreads very rapidly and gets into all the equipment. And it can be a huge cost to go back and literally tear all of that equipment down to the nuts and bolts, sanitize it to kill the Listeria before you can get that factory back up and running. Louis Pasteur in the mid-1800s developed a process to kill the microbes in foods such that they could be packaged and shipped and sold to the masses in large cities. Without the pasteurization process, there's a huge potential for food poisoning, for Listeria and other microbes to infect people via our food sources. So Jalisco could have taken their raw milk and pasteurized it. And that's really important because, again, once you get Listeria into the process, if you're not adequately pasteurizing things, it ends up in your cheese, it ends up in your slicer, it ends up in your packaging line. So even if you're pasteurizing the milk later, you still have that potential for contamination in all the downstream equipment.
Pasteurization involves heating a liquid, such as milk or wine, to a specific temperature for a specific amount of time to kill harmful bacteria and extend the shelf life of the product. The pasteurization process has played a significant role in improving public health and continues to be an important food safety practice today.
Now, pasteurization doesn't kill all the bacteria. If it completely killed all the bacteria, the shelf life of milk would be indefinite, right? Because there's nothing there to make it go bad or sour. But while there may be some bacteria in there, it's in very small numbers. So if you're drinking it, your own immune system can fight it off. The risks come from raw milk or unpasteurized milk. And the reason why some people are interested in that is that the same high temperatures that will kill off bacteria will also damage and affect the proteins in the milk. And so there's this thought that it's better and healthier for you if you haven't also damaged and killed off the proteins that are in the milk. But at the same time, you're taking a bigger risk. And because Listeria can happily live in milk or milk products and continue to grow and divide even at lower temperatures like refrigeration, which is another thing we do to limit bacterial growth. And so we see risks for listeriosis coming out of milk products that are unpasteurized, soft cheeses that don't go through a high enough temperature process, as well as deli meats, which may not be at a hot enough temperature after it's processed and sliced up. And so in those cases, any bit of contamination has time to grow in the cold refrigerator, along the supply chain, or in your own home, to the point where eating it will make you very sick.
In the aftermath of the 1985 Listeria outbreaks, strides were made to ensure food safety.
When we think about the foods that we eat, we don't really think about all the technology and everything that goes into making sure that those foods are safe. And when you look at modern packaging of foods, there's a lot that goes into sanitizing equipment, to sterilizing, to making sure the packaging doesn't become contaminated, to just in general making sure that the food that everybody's going to eat doesn't get contaminated with microbes. incoming products are pasteurized and sterilized. If it's a cooked food, it's cooked at high enough temperature that microbes will die off. When it goes through various pieces of equipment, those pieces of equipment are routinely cleaned with a clean-in-place process that uses strong acids and strong bases to kill any microbes that may have built up in that equipment. When we're talking about bottling or canning equipment, there's processes that are applied to those to make sure those products, the cans and bottles and packages themselves, are sterile. So there's a lot that goes into putting food into a container to make sure it doesn't have bacteria like Listeria.
The most common form of food poisoning is salmonella. And salmonella also occurs by eating food, generally unprocessed foods. But it comes from the urine and feces of infected animals that have picked it up. And so what you've got is a contamination effect. It's often found, for example, on salads, which have been grown on the same farm or downstream from where they're housing cattle. And that, more common, makes people really sick for a while, severe food poisoning. But it doesn't have the same effect. It's not crossing and affecting the baby. It's not causing stillbirths or miscarriages. When there's a disease that can affect the fetus, those are going to become more dangerous in the judgment of risk. And so the response to an outbreak of Listeria versus Salmonella is treated very differently when it comes to how quickly there is contact tracing, how quickly they're trying to track down the source of it, and the public's reaction to it.
The CDC estimates that 260 people a year die of Listeria. While Listeria is deadly, it's not the only deadly disaster that's invisible to the naked eye. Lake Nyos is a crater lake located in Cameroon in West Africa. In 1986, the area around Lake Nyos was a peaceful and remote farming region where villagers tended to crops and livestock in the shadow of an active volcano. The lake was known to the local population as a mysterious and sacred place, with legends of spirits and other supernatural phenomena associated with its deep waters.
The people who lived on the shores of Lake Nyos told stories of the monster who lived at the bottom of the lake and periodically would emerge to terrorize the lakeshore. As historians, it behoves us to listen to these oral histories and to understand that they are based in a form of truth that allows the people of these areas to contextualize their lives in a way that makes sense to them.
There are myths about the lake being evil and killing people. What that's really doing is warning people, maybe you don't want to be living around the lake.
The region surrounding Lake Nyos is a rural area, so there are many people farming in the region, people fishing in the local lakes. Lake Nyos itself is an incredibly deep lake, over 600 feet deep, which is pretty rare for most lakes around the world. And it's a very poverty-stricken area. People are essentially living more or less hand-to-mouth. They're farmers. They don't have a lot of surplus. They're not able to take time away from farming.
On August 21st, 1986, this once peaceful farming community would be changed forever.
People who had left the villages next to the lake and they had gone either into town or they were farming away from the edge of the lake, and they came back late at night to total silence. There were no sounds of humans, there were no sounds from livestock, there were no sounds from birds. Normally you would have all those sounds, and it was total silence. As they got closer to the lake, they found people lying on the ground, either dead or unconscious. They found livestock, dead or unconscious, everywhere.
They would have been in what looked to be peaceful positions. They would have been maybe eating dinner, maybe lying down to go to bed, or just maybe walking around. It would have been absolutely terrifying. Something horrible has happened here. I need to flee the area in case whatever has happened to these people is about to happen to me.
All told, some 1,800 people and 3,500 livestock perished at Lake Nyos. Many of the victims were found right where they'd normally be around 9 at night, suggesting they died on the spot. Bodies lay near cooking fires, clustered in doorways and in bed. Some people who had laid unconscious for more than a day finally awoke.
I lost my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and 4 children. Then coming down to chat, I lost my sister there, 1, and she had 3 children. One was still very young, 10 months old. So the one is alive.
Reports began to trickle out about what had happened, and locals finding human dead bodies and livestock dead on the shores of this lake. That became international news, and scientists from around the world were alerted and essentially dropped everything to go to this lake to figure out what happened. Of course, by the time they arrived, the CO2 had dissipated, been blown away by the winds, and the scientists began to take their samples, and they were sampling the chemical concentrations in the lake and looking for evidence of what was this poisoning event, because it was quite clear that you had to be a certain proximity to this lake in order to be affected.
But what caused the deadly event at Lake Nyos that killed nearly 2,000 people, and can it be prevented from happening again?
Those individuals who came back and saw people dead with not a mark on them and nobody around and going about their normal activities and saw entire livestock and villages just wiped out, couldn't attribute it to anything other than the fact that it was happening around the lake and wasn't happening away from the lake. So this leads to myths and legends about an evil in the lake that's killing people, and it's a way of passing on these warnings over time.
Lake Nyos is known as a limnic lake, which is a lake that doesn't turn over frequently. 99% of lakes around the world have a regular turnover, so that any of the water that's found on the bottom of the lake during one season will upwell and turn over, and the top layer of the water will then sink to the bottom. A limnic lake is very different in that it doesn't turn over. So you can have concentrations of chemicals and gases at one layer that are never truly mixed through other layers. And in the case of Lake Nyos, because it's on the margins of a volcano, there are steady supplies of CO2 to the bottom of the lake. Just a steady trickle of gas that comes in from the volcano. And if that was a regular lake that turned over, of course, the CO2 would be mixed throughout the entire lake. A limnic lake, the CO2 is concentrated at the bottom. So you have this steady increase of concentration of carbon dioxide until you get a trigger of some sort. And that could be a trigger like a small local earthquake. It could be a trigger that could be related to wave action on the surface. And essentially the carbon dioxide, which is still in suspension, begins to move towards the surface. And much like when you shake a pop bottle, all of a sudden that carbon dioxide comes out of solution as bubbles. And as the bubbles rise, they begin to expand, and that triggers even further CO2 expansion and release from the water until essentially you have a runaway explosive chain reaction, which burst onto the surface of that lake with such force, it actually triggered a tsunami that scientists have measured up to the 75-meter level. So that's an incredibly high tsunami by any terms.
CO2 is an interesting gas. It's part of the air we breathe, but only a very small percentage. CO2 is actually heavier than air, so it wants to sink to the bottom. So if I took the room that I'm sitting in and put CO2 into it, it would stratify to the lower portions of the room. If I got down on my hands and knees, I'd find that there was less oxygen there for me to breathe. There'd be more CO2, which prevents my lungs from respirating and getting rid of CO2 as easily, and I would quickly asphyxiate. So CO2 is particularly problematic as an asphyxiant because it's heavier than air.
So with this eruption of CO2, what you're doing is you're creating pockets of, in essence, what's dead air. Air that you can't use to breathe, to stay alive. But you can't see them. You can't see where they are. You can't see how they're going. And so when one of these dead air zones travels over a nearby village, the animals and the people, at a minimal level, they may feel lightheaded and start hyperventilating. At a higher level, they could die.
This is a relatively rare phenomenon because there's just not that many lakes that are near a volcano but not so close that their waters are warmed up and there's that relatively cool pressurized area at the bottom of the lake. But there is one lake that is far more terrifying than Lake Naos. That's Lake Kivu. Kivu has the same sort of structure. It's got that cool water at the bottom, but it's much, much larger. And there's about 2 or 3 million people around that lake. It's one of the African Great Lakes. So you've got the city of Goma sitting right on the edge of that lake. And if that lake ever overturns in a limnic eruption, you're talking about death tolls in the millions of people, because you cannot flee that fast enough to be able to get away from that gas cloud that is going to be instantly covering large urban areas. It's a beautiful spot to be in, but it's just a little bit scary knowing what's at the bottom of that lake.
But is there a way to stop these eruptions from happening in the future?
After the eruption, scientists began to speculate on ways to reduce the potential for future eruptions of the lake again. And one of the approaches that was actually quite successful was to install vertical pipes from the surface of the lake to the very bottom, so a 200-meter pipe that allows a small amount of the water at the bottom of the lake with CO2 in suspension to travel up the pipe. And as soon as that began to travel up the pipe, of course, the CO2 bubbles out and essentially creates a continuous chain of suction.
Thanks to the piping system, Lake Naos is much safer, and there's less fear of an eruption.
It's a huge challenge to try and detect whether a limnic lake is about to erupt or not. And part of that goes down to just the challenges of monitoring the lake conditions itself. So you have to get your monitoring instruments down 200 meters to the bottom of the lake. But then the question is, if we understand the concentration of CO2 levels, what does that mean? Does that mean that the lake is stable for the next 1 year or 20 years or 200 years? Because there's also a need for some sort of trigger. So you may have CO2 concentrations that are fairly stable until there's a local earthquake, which then creates the conditions for eruption. So it's this challenge between monitoring the chemical composition of the lake and then monitoring the other conditions that are needed to trigger the eruption.
These devastating events have left a lasting impact on the communities and regions affected. While we cannot predict when or where the next natural disaster will occur, it's important to continue learning from these past events. By working towards better systems for warning, response, and recovery, we can build a more resilient world that's better equipped to face the challenges of the future.